You guys hear me get on here a lot and talk about victims or survivors of abuse, but one of the things that we don't talk about is survivors of torture, and they're much harder to treat than a victim of abuse. Hi, my name is Dr. Natalie Jones. I spent many of years working with victims and perpetrators of abuse, and I want to just kind of get on here and talk a little bit about a survivor of torture, and I'm talking about um, not to compare apples to oranges and say that, torture is worse, but really torture is worse than abuse. And I've only, that I can remember anyway, because sometimes I get off here and I kind of, remember things. But I've only worked with women who are survivors of torture. And not to say that men don't, because men do. But when someone is tortured, I'm talking about someone who is stripped of basic human rights, like all of them. Like with abuse victims, again, in my experience, abuse victims are still allowed a certain level of freedom. So a lot of them are still allowed to go to work, eat, see daylight, things like that. They still have to deal with the ramifications of abuse in a lot of other ways, but there's a certain level of living that they're allowed to do. Whereas in my experience, the victims of torture that I've worked with have not been allowed to do that. Like they're not allowed to leave their home, like ever. A lot of them have not been allowed to see daylight. And so a lot of them have been chained, to, things into their home. And sorry about that, trigger warning. A lot of them have been chained to things in their home, like the toilet, or been locked downstairs in the basement. I've even worked with some who've been, put in a box and like hidden in places like that, so where they're not allowed. And then these victims are they're allowed out only for the purposes of like cooking or for their person, because a lot of times they're not allowed to eat food, the regular food that everybody else in the house eats, and then or sex, so they're only allowed to do things for the perpetrator, and then they're almost instantly put back into captivity, is what I'm trying to say. And they are very, very difficult to treat. And the reason that they're difficult to treat is because they walk around in a constant dissociative state. And so in layman's terms, this might not sound kind, but I want to put it in the simplest way that most people can understand. It's like the lights are on, but nobody's home. So they're kind of like, they're looking, but they're looking through you. And so they are completely disconnected 24/7. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that happens for years. And it's unfortunate because sometimes when people get taken out of captivity and things like that, they get put in domestic violence shelters, which is where I've worked. And unfortunately, they get into it's even more difficult for them to be in a shelter, right? Because there's other people that are also in a shelter. And a lot of times, women who come out of captivity are often coming with children, unfortunately, and even little children. And these women, they're in such dissociative states that they can't, they're not able to care for their children. Like they may be able to do some things like feed their children, but in terms of correction and discipline, they can't do that a lot of times because they're just so checked out, or they're easily triggered by that. And so, and I've seen situations, unfortunately, where, I've had to speak to some victims, and it comes to a point of like where they may actually have to get evicted from shelters due to their children. And unfortunately, a lot of times what people don't understand is when someone has been a victim of torture, a lot of times kids, even kids as young as, I've even seen it, kids as young as like 1.5, 1 years old, they've already picked up on the perpetrator's behavior. And so a lot of times when they get in places like shelters or in areas where they're around little kids for the first time, you start to see them become very violent. And again, this is like infants, basically toddlers, that become very violent towards other children, and so much so that it's actually life-threatening, which is interesting to see. But it's also dangerous. And unfortunately, in a lot of shelters, there's not a lot of resources where people can have 24-hour, supervision, and certainly not hands-on, right? Where you physically may have to, take a child off of another child because they're so volatile and violent, and they're spitting on other children. I mean, they're just doing all kinds of stuff, right? And, so it can be very difficult to try to manage that. And, some of these women, unfortunately, have really poor outcomes. And I'm trying to think of like a famous case, because this comes across in criminal work too, legal work sometimes. But, one of the cases that's close, that sort of stands out in my mind, is the Hedda Nussbaum and the Joel Steinberg and Elisa Steinberg case. And that was back in the 80s, and I remember seeing that. And I'm just going off the top of my dome, so you guys will forgive me if I don't get every aspect of it right, which I probably should have researched before I hopped on here. But anyhow, what I remember from that case is it was a situation where Joel and Hedda had adopted Lisa. And Hedda had been a model and Joel was an attorney. And ultimately, again, trigger warning, what ended up happening was that Joel ended up beating Lisa to death. And this is actually, this kind of stuff happens quite commonly. But, it'd been found out, I think, that Lisa had been beaten for a number of years before she ultimately succumbed to her injuries. And, Hedda was put on trial as part of she was his co-defendant, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And the allegations were that, he was beating Lisa, but you as an adult shoulda, woulda, coulda intervened to save Lisa. And the fact that you didn't, you should be held as criminally responsible as Joel, right, for this young baby's murder. And so, it was televised from what I remember. And I just remember when Hedda came on, when they finally brought her on to the stand, because, she had been once a supermodel, again, if my memory serves me correctly, but when they brought her out into the stand, everybody sort of gasped because she didn't look anything like what she was supposed to look like. Her face literally had been rearranged. I think her nose was like on one side of her face, but she was also very just sort of like, there was sort of like this zombie-esque like demeanor to her where she was just like, and you could see very easily this wasn't an act. You could see that this was clearly a woman that had been, just severely just tortured. I mean, she didn't even look like herself. Like her friends and her family didn't even recognize her. They hadn't heard from her for a number of years, if my memory serves me correctly. And Hedda Nussbaum, I think they let her go. And they said that she was not guilty based upon, all of those things. But she immediately went into hiding. She's changed her name. And I think she since has had corrective surgeries and things like that. But she's no longer Hedda Nussbaum. But she's an example of a woman that I think, sort of portrays that, like, she hadn't been allowed to leave her home and, all these kinds of things. And so she just really... there was nothing that she could do to control her circumstances because she was very much a victim of herself for many years.